The results of the studies reported in empirical articles obviously contribute to our knowledge about the variables in the study. Understanding research design and applying logic also allows us to apply the results to increase our knowledge about related variables. When we think about what we can learn from what we read in an article, it's helpful to remember the difference between primary and secondary sources, along with what we know about APA style. One thing that creates confusion is that empirical articles are a combination of primary and secondary sources. The introduction section is primarily a secondary source, and parts of the discussion might be too. The variables, participants, procedure, and results are all primary source information, and authors frequently summarize their results in the discussion, which would be primary source information. It can get complicated, though, because authors do combine ideas in the introduction and discussion sections in a way that makes an original point, a process sometimes referred to as synthesizing. The information about specific measures of the variables is also sometimes from other sources. The information in both primary and secondary sources is helpful, but we're going to focus on applying what you're learning about research methods, so we'll be looking at the portion of the article that's a primary source. We've also been working with strategies to make it easier, and it's part of the reason I have you use the summary worksheet. We'll refer to 3 parts of the worksheet in thinking about what we know from each study: the variables, the design, and the summary of results. Note that I say the variables and not the operational definitions. The operational definitions are an important part of designing a study and help us interpret the meaning of the variable, but the author's emphasis is on the variable, and the measure is just a way to get to that. Plus, some of the information about the operational definition is often from another source. So far, I've focused on the content we're drawing on. We also have to think about the different ways to say it, though, and how to give credit for the information, otherwise known as sentence structure and citations. There are really countless ways we can structure our writing, so I'm going to make some really broad generalizations to give us a starting point. I hope those generalizations about structure also help clarify the difference between the citation formats. That said, one common approach to writing about the results of an article is what I call reporting. The writer states the who and the what. In this case, it's the authors of the study and what they found. That structure would use the narrative citation format. Summarizing is similar to reporting. It pretty much lists the findings, but is structured in a way that doesn't refer directly to the authors or to a study. That structure uses a parenthetical citation. Summarizing is still pretty narrow in focus, though, and we don't need to be that narrow as long as we're accurate. That's where paraphrasing comes in. The ideas and information from the primary source can be presented in a different context or a different form, with the parenthetical citation signaling that the ideas are based on the primary source. This might be a little different than you've thought about paraphrasing before, because none of these structures are using quotations or copying word for word from the primary source. Sentences reporting on or summarizing the findings are written in the words of the person writing about the studies. Given that, another way to think about the idea of paraphrasing in this context is that we're making logical extensions based on the findings of a study. I'll explain a few more things we have to keep in mind, but before we get to those details, examples will probably be helpful. We've looked at the Burton and King articles as we've applied each of the concepts, so we can refer back to that to think about what we need to know based on a study, or what we do know based on a study. This slide summarizes the information we need from the article and gives an example of each approach to explaining what we know given that information. As you review these examples, note 2 things. First, even though the reporting structure uses the same words the article uses to identify the variables, it isn't an exact phrase or sentence from the article, so it does not have to be in quotation marks. Second, both the summarizing and paraphrasing sentences use the phrase maybe. That signals to the reader that the ideas are in the author's own words and goes along with the fact that the findings are based on probability, and so forth. Notice that the three sentence structures differ in the verb tense and in their tone, too. The reporting structure, the one with the narrative citation, is consistently written in the past tense. That's also the only structure that's always direct in stating the relationship between variables. In contrast, paraphrasing is in present or future tense, and it's more tentative or suggestive in tone. When we think about it, it makes sense. If we're applying the findings in a different context or form, we're speculating. The reporting structure uses past tense because it's talking about the findings of a completed study. When we paraphrase to make a logical extension, we're writing about how the findings might inform our knowledge. But since we don't know for sure, we're writing in the present or the future tense. Sentences that summarize the findings are in present or future tense and are more tentative. If this type of sentence is in past tense or more direct, it can be confusing because the reader isn't sure about the source of the information. When we're using the reporting and summarizing structures, the knowledge we can gain is simply the results of the study. To write about that information accurately, we need to make sure the wording gives the correct impression about the design and the variables included in the study. For example, we know that Burton and King conducted an experiment where they manipulated writing, measured mood, and measured health center visits, and found that writing about positive experiences was associated with enhanced positive mood and better health. It was an experiment, so it's accurate to use a structure that suggests cause and effect, but they didn't measure stress. So a sentence saying that they found writing could reduce stress is not accurate. As you might have gathered, when we're paraphrasing, we have a little more flexibility in what we can say. We can use various forms of logic, including inductive and deductive reasoning, to think about how the results add to our knowledge. This approach requires wording that's more tentative, though, because it's not directly supported by the results. That helps the reader know that part of the idea is really ours, but it's supported by the findings from the study and the cited article. It's a good rule of thumb to focus on one part of the research design when making a logical extension. When we think this way, we're really speculating about how we think the results of the study relate to other variables or to other populations. But if we speculate too much, we're really just coming up with ideas that are not supported by the results. The example on this slide also illustrates the importance of verb tense and sentence structure in paraphrasing. As it's written, the sentence gives the impression that the study in the cited article measured stress because it's in present tense and directly states the findings. We know, though, that Burton and King didn't measure stress, so it isn't accurate to support this sentence with a citation for that article. If we changed reduces to may reduce, though, it would signal its speculation based on the findings of the article, and it'd be okay. The second article I use in the examples, by Hurst, Baranik, and Daniel, is even more helpful for thinking about what we can and can't say in the different structures given the design of the study. This is the study that compiled the results of other studies about sources of stress in college students to increase our understanding of the sources of stress. This study includes findings about several sources of stress, so we could accurately report on the results in a number of ways. The information in the top row of this slide is just one example. The paraphrase statement in the top row is an accurate paraphrase because the phrase may cause signals that it's based on a logical extension of the findings, and the phrase day-to-day events is a way to categorize some of the sources of stress that the authors list in Table 2 in the article. The study was not experimental, though, so it's not accurate to use a reporting structure and say that they found the relationships caused an increase in stress. That statement is also not accurate because they did not look at studies that measured changes in stress, and the word increase implies that there was a measure of change. The inaccurate example of paraphrasing does use may be to signal that it's not a direct summary of the results, but both the variable and the design are represented in the sentence and are both different from the actual study, so it's not accurate to support this sentence with a citation for Burton and King. The sentence suggests that the findings included information about smoking, but they didn't, and that the study somehow compared students to determine which group had higher levels of stress, but it didn't. Now that you've seen a couple of examples, it might be helpful to pause the recording and practice thinking about reporting and paraphrasing what we know based on the findings from the study in the Schiffrin and Nelson article. There isn't one right answer when we think about what we know based on the results of a study. While we need to make sure our wording accurately represents the research design, even the reporting of the findings can vary because we can use different wording to explain the same thing. Your notes could be different than the examples in this slide then. As long as they don't suggest causation, you're probably on the right track. The example of paraphrasing in the slide signals that it's paraphrasing by using may and only includes the variables that were included in the study. So it's accurate to refer to a cause and effect relationship even though the study was non-experimental. When we think about how the results of a study add to our understanding, we're thinking about knowledge from a primary source. That leads us to focus on particular parts of empirical articles. Then, thinking about the different ways we can write about the findings helps us think about what those findings mean. To accurately know what we know based on the findings, though, we need to apply our knowledge of research, design, and methods.